Hello, my name is Elaine Grace and I am the CEO of the Actuaries Institute of Australia. We are delighted to be hosting this important congress with the IAA and welcome you all to Sydney. Although Australia's First Nations people have lived here for over 65,000 years, Australia is also a country of immigrants. I arrived in Australia in 1999 after two years of backpacking through Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. These global travels opened up my eyes to incredible human spirit, the value of community, the wonderful nature in the world, but also to the impacts of poverty, war, and our vulnerability to climate change. My passion was ignited, and through the wonder of the actuarial profession, I had the opportunity to join and then chair energy and environment committees, to land a sustainability role for a leading Australian insurance company developing their climate change with inspirational actuary Tony Coleman, who I've seen out there today, and to work with many scientists, policymakers, NGOs, and other businesses to try and tackle this problem. I tell this story from more than 20 years ago because I think we all have this passion to use our actuarial skills for good. It's important to acknowledge that our expertise, our skills, and our professionalism are in demand and are useful. It's also important to acknowledge that every single one of us has to contribute to actually solving these difficult societal issues that are facing us. Every country is facing and experiencing the impacts of climate change. And as the Honourable Stephen Jones said this morning, Australia has experienced unprecedented levels of bushfires, droughts, floods, and storm surges. We need to address this issue urgently. We need to work together across disciplines, across countries to find solutions. We need to reduce the threat, improve resilience, and protect those most vulnerable. I would like to acknowledge that we have much to learn from our First Nation Australians, their connection with their land, their innate wisdom of sustainability, and their nature-based solutions that will improve resilience. And I walk with them in finding solutions. It's my honor to chair this panel today, which will look at the latest climate change science and, importantly, how actuaries can contribute. So we have Natalie Hurtado, founder of RT, an award-winning organization which helps businesses to transition to net zero. Natalie has over 20 years insurance experience, having been a Brazilian regulatory authority and the constitution of the Sustainable Insurance Forum under UNEP-FI. We also have Jacki Johnson. Jacki is Commissioner for Illawarra, Shoalhaven in New South Wales, a non-executive director of Community First Mutual Bank, a PhD candidate, and much, much more. So I'll keep going. And of course, we have Rade. He's going to sound American, but he is Australian, and we're going to claim him. So obviously, Rade, a principal at Affinity Consulting, recent chair of our Australian Climate Change Working Group, also chairs the International Actuarial Association's Resource and Environment Forum, and importantly represented us, the actuarial profession, at the recent COP27 meetings at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Rade champions our Australian Actuaries Climate Index and has done much more. But with that, I would like to welcome Natalie to the stage.
Oh, thanks. Is that it? It's not. I left it here. It's not here anymore.
Okay, I'm going to ask I'll ask Jacki to go first.
Okay. My papers. I have left my papers here. It's not here anymore.
Where were they?
I put here.
We'll get Jacki to go first, if that's okay. Thank you.
Maybe it's yours?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh,
They
look,
were
we've
sitting on
got them.
top
We've
of
found
mine.
them. Tim's got them.
okay.
Tim's got them. Cooperation.
Nothing like
Cooperation
stealing
and
someone else's
collaboration.
notes.
Very good. Okay. Are you happy to go now?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Collaboration.
Yes. Good morning. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we gather today and the land where I live in, the Yugara and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge my ancestors, indigenous and traditional peoples of the Americas and Africa. Maybe the other one? Yes. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. When I first came across this Aboriginal wisdom, I was quite impressed how strongly it resonates with my own entrepreneurial journey. Sorry, yes. I was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but I also have a beloved place called Trinidad, within the Bolivian Amazon rainforest. This is the place where my father came from. In 2013, I spent 1 week living in that area of the Amazon. Yes. It was an experience that made me feel deeply connected to the forest. I realized that my way to liberation was bound with the preservation of the forest and its inhabitants. However, at that point, I had no idea of how I could do that. So the next year, I became Secretary General of the Brazilian Insurance Supervisory Authority. And in 2015, we achieved important milestones with the adoption of Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. It was also in 2015 that an environmental disaster involving Vale and BHP devastated the Doce Basin River, a huge area of forest in Brazil. Indigenous people and riverbank communities were severely affected. The impact of the disaster extended to the Atlantic Ocean. However, just 20% of the loss was covered by insurance. All of that created the right environment for insurance regulators to come together and work with the United Nations Environmental Programme to launch a forum where we could discuss and harmonize future regulations, climate regulations. The Sustainable Insurance Forum was then created under the umbrella of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors and the United Nations Environmental Programme, and I had the honor of being one of its founders, representing the Brazilian government. In 2017, however, Brazil started winding up back their environmental policies and put several initiatives on hold. I was transitioned to another role, and a new Secretary General was appointed. I had so much energy and motivation to work on the environmental and climate agenda, but I felt constrained. I realized it was time to change and move away from Brazil. After the process of choosing a country to adopt as a new home and getting the permanent residency for Australia, my family and I moved to Brisbane. Knowing no one and having a business idea in mind, I decided to do a master's in entrepreneurship and innovation at the University of Queensland, UQ, focusing on sustainability and community development. In 2019, I participated in my first startup competition, the Global Business Challenge. My team was runner-up and was awarded 15K. Through this experience, I met my co-founder, Dr. Safira Recker, senior lecturer in sustainable finance at UQ, and expert on science-based targets methodologies. Just after I completed the master's at UQ, Rade was accepted at the ICA2023 acceleration program. We appointed our final co-founder and CTO and founded the business. So, what Rade does? Rade is a profit-for-purpose climate tech startup with the mission to accelerate a net zero future through our SaaS platform. We do this by supporting small and medium-sized business to target, monitor, and report their progress towards net zero, and with an accurate, objective, and cost-efficient solution. Rade is equally committed to support indigenous-led carbon sink conservation initiatives in Australia and in the Amazon rainforest. Last year, Rade was selected to participate in the Low Carbon Accelerator program, backed by the Queensland government. Through this program, Rade is partnering with Earthtrade, an Australian leader in biodiversity offsets and environmental market advisory. This partnership has helped us gain deeper industry knowledge, particularly in the mining and agricultural sectors, and has been invaluable for Rade to achieve market fit. My experience has informed my belief in partnerships as an effective way to grow 21st century purposeful businesses, more holistically than venture capital or even impact investments. I firmly believe that if we can find a collective intent to grow together with the same sense of liberation, we can thrive consistently. And this is why I finish my speech with my initial statement. Thank you very much.
I know quite a few of you in the room, but I also would like to thank Elaine Grace for the opportunity to speak today, but in particular acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And just mention before I get into my slides is actually emphasise why it's so important. And this morning it was mentioned that the census for Indigenous actually was only in 1967. And my husband is First Nations, but was never allowed to identify. And so he would have been 4 at the time, and then I was an immigrant as a 6-year-old in 1969, which actually brings the point about what we're doing here in Australia is for an inclusive society where my daughter and my granddaughter can claim both of our heritages from being from Liverpool, England, and Indigenous. But on this topic of climate change, I have learned through my insurance career how much First Nations can contribute to communities in particular, and helping us with some of the science that Tim mentioned as well. So I don't think when we say acknowledgement to country, it's just placating. I think many of us now realise just why reconciliation is so important for our country. I also want to my talk for the next few minutes will be about a sense of hope. We heard from Tim all the science of where we are. And for me, and many of you in the room, we've seen firsthand in insurance when planning hasn't gone well. And I have been very critical of many levels of government and society for putting people at harm's way when we have floods or bushfires, or in my New Zealand part of my career, earthquakes. And then Tim mentioned sea level rise and the complexity of when these events all come together. I was fortunate enough last year to be appointed in September as the Illawarra Shoalhaven Commissioner as part of the Greater Cities Commission. And when Elaine and I were talking about today, we thought it was a good opportunity to bring a bit of sense of hope of what can be different in the future if we have an approach that can actually bring local, state and federal government together for planning, for housing and jobs, and making sure infrastructure is planned in a way that addresses climate change. And so for those that are not from Australia or New South Wales, Just to give a bit of a sense of what this region is, it's 6 cities coming together to look at global competitiveness, scale, but a sense of uniqueness and identity for the individual cities. And so we have 6 commissioners looking after the cities and being the intermediary between hearing the council's work, the community, and state and federal government. But if you can see the challenge of this, we've got 6 million people, which if you think about that, it's bigger than the size of Singapore, bigger than New Zealand, all living in this very thin strip. And where Tim and I live, it's a very thin strip because we've got the escarpment of mountains on one side and the ocean in the other. And we need to think about future growth and where are we going to put people to live so we don't put them at harm's way. And that's really what we're talking about when we think about good planning and how the collective minds that are in this room contribute right around the world in making sure data is used in a way where we can have good planning. But that won't be enough. The behavioural scientists in the room need to think about how that data brings about change of behaviour. And so if we've got all these people wanting to live around our coast, then what is it that we need in terms of the change of the way we think about where the houses are, how are they built, and the skills that we will need to make sure that we can transition our economy. So the jobs of the future are the jobs in the new economy. But Tim made a really good point. We also have to transition. And so it's how are we using the current economy to fund the future. And so what the Greater Cities Commission is attempting to do, under statute, we need to give 5, 10, 20-year housing targets to Cabinet very shortly, and then it will be open up for consultation to the community and all other stakeholders. We need to think about what is the mitigation and adaptation that needs to happen, and those that are New South Wales based and have worked in general insurance understand that within those 6 cities, we actually have a thing called Hawkesbury that is actually prone to quite a lot of flooding. And if that's the land which is available for building, then it can only be done if there is enough investment in its mitigation and adaptation. And Tim mentioned about retreat. Are there very difficult conversations that need to be had across the cities about where people have already been put in harm's way and the risks can't be mitigated? They are very difficult conversations that need a lot of evidence before you start making those sort of decisions. And I'm very pleased to say that very many actuaries have been contributing to many inquiries here in Australia that we're reliant on that information. But it really is also about people. And what I loved about some of the opening remarks today was that human impact. Let's never, ever forget that we're not just looking at data and spreadsheets. We're talking about people's lives. And we really need to think about how we're helping people make good choices on green and adaptable homes that are energy efficient. And how are we making sure that people have the right information to choose where they want to live and are aware of the risks. And that actually being aware of them is not enough to get the change. The time I was in New Zealand, I loved the idea that you had a land information sheet every time you bought a property. Did that stop people buying property in liquefied lands so when the earthquakes happened, everyone had a liquefaction problem? But people knew it was on their land information. So I would challenge everyone in the room to say, yes, you might have data and you might have evidence for people to make decisions, but how do we actually think about using actuarial knowledge and the smarts to think about how do we get that behavioural change where people take enough into account? And how we then think about the innovation jobs of the future. The idea of the city planning is to look at, can we have 30-minute cities, which is being talked about all around the world, and many of you will be talking about that in your own countries, where the jobs are close to where people live. Because that also helps us manage the emissions and the emission reductions, but it also makes for a better social environment and a much more community-minded. And I just wanted to finish on, this isn't all about planning and data. It's about behavioural change and how we collaborate between levels of government, community and industry. And if we really want to be resilient, as called out in our own Sendai submissions as a country, we need to connect the domains of the way we get change. And it's about how we all work together and use the smarts that are in this room to make for a better future. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Rade. You don't make us do.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you today. I think it's appropriate that we've spent a bit of time today thinking about the First Nations people and how we have a 65,000-year culture, which in a mere 200 years, the country was totally transformed since the arrival of the colonists. In my own career, which started in the 1970s, I remember high inflation. We had no spreadsheets, we had no laptops, we had no internet, no mobile phones. And to just think about the amount of change that we have seen in the last 40, 45 years, it is a hopeful sign that if we can change as much as we have just in my short career, it may be that we can change all of the things that Tim was talking about too. It's not all bad news. There is massive opportunity. And I'd like to leave you with 3 thoughts on actuaries before we go to questions. The first is, I'll tell you a story about an outbreak of tornadoes in Kentucky that happened in December, I believe 2021, which was an unprecedented ferocity of tornadoes went through the state of Kentucky in the United States. At a time of year when they should not have seen extreme tornadoes and where there was no way you could have engineered the housing stock to allow for that. That happened at the same time that lumber prices were 3 to 5 times the historical average because of beetle infestations in Canada and fires and other things that decimated the lumber crop coming out of the forests in Canada. So what that says is that an actuary looking at a catastrophe model in those days needed to be thinking about both the climate science and what it could do, and also the economic science of what would happen if there were supply shortages. And in this case, both these things were enhanced by climate change. But it's important that we understand not only actuarial science, but climate science, economic science, and yes, political science. But it's not all about us becoming multidisciplinary. It's also about us learning how we can contribute to the understanding of other professions to do a more effective job. About 13 years ago, I spoke to a room full of structural engineers like this. And I said, it was a building, they were looking at the building codes, and I said something that to me seemed completely obvious, which is if you're going to build a building with a 100-year design life, you better think about the climate over the next 100 years. And it looked like one of those 1960s science fiction movies where the smoke was coming out of the robot's ears and everybody seized up because they were like, how could you do that? We don't know what, we design buildings, we have to know what the requirements are. We have to engineer for the risk. We don't understand what the risk is going to be in the future. And I said, well, you better figure that out. And maybe we can help you by helping you think about building codes in a way where you think stochastically, you think about probabilities, you think about multiple future states, and how to design things resiliently. So that's the second thing I'd leave you with. The last thing is that it took me a long time. I'm pretty stubborn. It takes me a long time to learn things. And one of the lessons I had to learn as an actuary was the difference between the correct answer and the right answer. And I'll give you an example. You know, we discovered address level pricing as actuaries. And we used to charge risks at a postcode or even, Lord forbid, a state level for floods and catastrophes. And then we, through technology and other tools that people like me developed, we all of a sudden started rating at the address level. Well, the correct answer is now that we know your house is risky, we should charge you and send you a risk signal. Okay? But 20 years ago, when you bought that house, we didn't send you a risk signal. So perhaps the right answer is to figure out a way to send the risk signal while we still understand that that's somebody's home, their community, their retirement savings, and we strike some balance between sending signals and transitioning folks into resilient and strong housing. So I think that's a lesson that I think all of us as actuaries need to understand, that sometimes, as we used to say in the Institute years ago, it's about more than maths. And it's also about learning how we can contribute to the larger challenges that is going to require a whole host of people to try to solve these immense challenges we face. Thank you.